Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 343 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on what does a speech and language therapist do? And it is Saturday, the 6th of September 2025 as I record this. So today's podcast episode is absolutely brilliant, it's a lot of fun, and we really get to look at another aspect of what you can do with a psychology degree. There's a lot of different speech and language therapists that I've worked with over the years. They've had degrees in psychology, but the traditional psychologist route wasn't right for them. But they flat out love language development, child development, so they wanted to combine that in interest. So they used their psychology degree as a really good basis, and then they did their speech and language career on top of that. And one of the reasons why I'm doing today's podcast episode is because next week I have an interview to be a speech and language therapy assistant. So I'm looking forward to that in too. I think if I get the role, I'll definitely learn a lot. But in preparation of that interview, I just want to focus a bit more on what speech and language therapists actually do. So it's a brilliant podcast episode. I really enjoyed it, and I know you're going to learn a lot about what is the role, what do speech and language therapists do, who do they work with, and how do you become a speech and language therapist, amongst other topics. So it's an information-filled podcast episode. So you got that to look forward to in the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the psychology news section. We're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest, and the first one is Conspiracy Theorists Aren't Cognitive Misers. Why do people believe in implausible claims? Some explanations point to gaps in knowledge, lack of trust in institutions, or to difficulty distinguishing fact from conspiracy. Another suggestion is that it's down to lazy thinking, failing to weigh out the evidence and accept information at face value. This might not be the full story, argue Samuel Robson and colleagues in the Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition. Across 3 studies, they found both believers and non-believers in common conspiracy theories evaluated evidence just as carefully regardless of its quality. Dismissing conspiracy theories as cognitive misers, therefore, could be an oversimplification. Oh, okay, now this is a really useful one. And I know that I've spoken about conspiracy theorists on the podcast before, in books and in person with lots of different lecturers. To be honest, at some point I would love to get Professor Karen Douglas on the podcast. One, because I love her accent. Her Australian accent is amazing. But also she does so much conspiracy theory research, and I've not actually had the chance to talk to her since 2019, which was my first year at university. So I think generally speaking, it's very easy for all of us to just dismiss people we don't like or we don't agree with as cognitive misers, or we try and minimize them. We try and make ourselves better than them. For example, non-conspiracy theorist believers, we aware more of the evidence, we think critically more, we're happier in our lives, we are more intelligent because we don't fall for conspiracy theories, etc. I think that sort of intergroup social comparison is very common, and I think that's very easy to fall into. But as this research shows, conspiracy theorists aren't actually down to a lack of intelligence or cognitive biases, and they simply accept information at face value. I think we need to be very careful when we make those sort of generalizations and when we try and oversimplify the process. Because, as I always say, when it comes to human behavior, there's always a multitude of different factors that lead to a given behavior, including the development about why people believe in conspiracy theories. So this is just like good to know and be aware of. And this does raise more pressing questions, more particularly about right. If both conspiracy theorists and non-conspiracy theorists both evaluate the same information, what is the difference? So clearly, it's something to do in the interpretation of the evidence, and that's something that we might have to build on in future studies. So just some food for thought. So the second one is being alone doesn't have to mean loneliness. Feeling lonely can be incredibly difficult, frequently linked to poor mental health, changes in brain structure, and even physical illness. Loneliness can profoundly change the way we experience the world. Yet, spending time alone can also be beneficial. A distinct experience from loneliness, being in one's own company, can foster a sense of peace, self-connection, and autonomy. How we think about time alone then may have a significant impact on how we feel about it. Fighting in natural communications, a University of Michigan team explores this topic. They find those with negative beliefs about being alone experience a steep increase in their loneliness after spending time alone, but that those who feel good about it feel less lonely after being alone. So this is the sort of psychological finding that I flat out love, because it really does show that your perceptions, your beliefs fundamentally impact your mental health, and they also can impact your physical health, which I always find flat out fascinating. So personally, I do not mind spending alone time. Like, I quite like it. I find it more energizing. It definitely saves me from being socially exhausted, because as much as I flat out loved my outreach work, when I was out peopling for so long, to be honest, that was socially draining. So I needed a lot of a social rest. And because I'm a podcaster, because I'm a writer, I'm an author, I'm a business owner, that means that I spend quite a lot of my time alone to some extent. And that I do not mind. I find that really relaxing. But equally, there are times that when I'm like, oh, I would love to go out and like see people, but my friends aren't in the area. And there's been a lot of upheaval recently in my life, which has led to a whole bunch of different complications. But I always try and remain positive when I'm meant to be feeling lonely, and and that I say in air quotes there, because I think if you start thinking that you're lonely, then that's when your mental health starts to decline. And because I did the neuropsychology of aging module at my university last academic year, wow, that was almost a year ago now. Oh wow, time really does fly. And I learned how devastating the impact of the loneliness is. And that's what I really try and like focus on, the fact that I do have lots of friends, that I am very well socially connected, and spending time alone is not a bad thing. So just some food for thought, I think. So the last one is teens with mental health conditions use socials differently. Though often presented in the media as monolithic, our experiences of social media can drastically differ based on factors like who we are and how we use it, what we engage with, and how we feel after a scrolling session, which can be entirely different from one day to the next, all shaped by our mood, intentions, and mental health. In natural human behaviour, a team from the universities of Oxford and Cambridge explored the differences in social media use between young people with and without mental health conditions. They find that teens with mental health conditions, such as anxiety and depression, report being particularly negatively affected by social media and have lower self control when it comes to time spent online. So, this is something that I talk a lot more about in my book, Social Media Psychology, because in that book, I talk about what's known as active social media use. So this is when you're liking, you're commenting, you're you're having a very active social role in your social media use. But then I also talk about passive social media use. So this is when you're engaging, you're liking, you're getting a social benefit from social media. This is literally just you scrolling. And as you can imagine, passive social media use is linked to a massive increase in negative mental health outcome. And I know from my personal experience, when I was suffering the worst of my PTSD after my rape last year, I was really struggling with social media because I was scrolling tons. I was on my phone so much because I was just so depressed. I couldn't do anything. But that was only making it worse because I was seeing everyone else living these brilliant lives, going on holiday, enjoying time with their families and everything. And I was just stuck at home doing PTSD reactions and living in absolute hell. So that didn't work. And because I wasn't using social media actively, like I wasn't commenting, I wasn't getting social interaction, etc., that only made my mental health worse. So I definitely agree with this. If you want to learn more, please check out my book at Social Media Psychology in all the usual places. So I hope you enjoy the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. This week has been insanely busy, but I'm so happy at the moment. Like, oh my god, today has just been amazing. It's been so lovely because one of the things that I did today was I spoke to a really good university friend of mine, and she's actually coming on the podcast in 2 weeks. No, actually, yep, 2 weeks. A week. So a week from this podcast episode going out, we were recording today's podcast episode. My camera did not work, which was a slightly problematic, but it was such a nice interview. I know you're going to get so much out of it. And I was just thinking, one, I flat out love talking to Alia. She's really interesting. She's really passionate, and I've been friends up with her for ages. And we both get quite personal in this podcast in interview. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that with all of you. And I learned stuff about her that I didn't know before. And to be honest, me doing podcast interviews was just such a nice experience that I really am considering just doing more and more of them, especially because I didn't realize that Alia knows someone who gets involved in air crash investigations and he used to do psychology. I am so into that topic. I'm like, oh, that guy sounds so interesting because, as tragic as this stuff is, air crash investigation. I used to watch programs on that when I was a kid, and it always seemed such fascinating work. So, to be honest, I am going to do a more official LinkedIn post and Facebook post. But if you want to pitch me to be on the podcast, please email me at connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. I would love to hear from you if you've got an interesting topic, whether this is how you became an assistant psychologist, how you first got into psychology. If you've got anything psychology related that you think might make a good episode, pitch me. I will either say yes or no, or I will work with you to develop your pitch. I really do want to do this a lot more because I'm so excited to talk to other psychologists and talk to other people doing fascinating things in psychology. And I hope from my voice you can tell how excited I am. Plus, another reason why I'm excited is that it is less than 1 week until Demon Slayer Infinity Castle is going to be released. Should be such a stunning film that I'm really looking forward to it. And yes, this is definitely an autistic special interest. I love Demon Slayer. I'm so excited. Speaking of which, if you listeners, if any of you are Demon Slayer fans, email me and we can talk about it, or message me on social media. I'm more than happy to waste a good hour talking about Demon Slayer. It is epic. Anyway, going back to my more professional side as this podcast host, which makes me laugh because I'm not that sure about if anything to do with this podcast is very professional, but it's part of the fun and it's my show. And all of you wonderful listeners that keep listening, which I'm really, really grateful for. Also, in more useful stuff, so I've had some more job in that this week. So I've had two more at the same place at the same day though. So they went really well. They were learning support A assistants, and the reason why I'm telling you this is just that we all know that getting a job in psychology is so hard. It feels impossible at times. And here's something I'm reflecting on quite a bit at the moment about just how difficult it is. And sometimes you need to look at psychology adjacent careers if you ever want that clinical experience. So I've applied for these learning support roles, and I'm really glad that I'm able to give really good examples. They're detailed, they're to the point, but that I think definitely helps me. Now, I didn't get one of the job in at those that I got, but that I went for, and I'm still waiting to hear from the other one. But I'm just keep applying, and this is something that me and Alia were talking about today in this podcast in Athu. Like, you are going to get rejected at times, and to be honest, it feels impossible. You're just going to get rejection after rejection after rejection. But if you just keep going, keep applying, something will pop up eventually. At least that is what I'm telling myself, because I've applied for so many jobs at this point. To be honest, even if I'm not fully qualified, because I keep coming back to the sort of stereotypical straight white man thing, even though I'm none of them except white, that straight white men, they will apply for a role even if they don't meet all of the criteria, and women will not. And that's why men tend to get into more positions of power. So that's one of the reasons why I'm just applying for everything, just in the off chance that whether I can actually get a job that way. And it's definitely working to some extent because I'm getting more into those, but then it's not in other three aspects. So my small takeaway message at the end of this personal update is just please just keep applying. Do not lose hope, as tough as it is. And yes, I am actually going to start looking at retail jobs, even as disheartening as that is. Because at this point in time, I would just like a job to some extent. So it's just something that we've all got to think about. And if you're struggling to find a job after your graduation, then you are not alone. This is normal, it's understandable, and I understand how frustrating it is. Believe me, I do. But it's sadly just part of the process. And whether that's right or wrong, we can debate a whole different time. So, as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So, you can always email me, connorwiley@connorwiley.net. You can always leave a comment to have a show notes at connorwiley.net/podcast, or you can tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi Wiley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And always feel free to send pictures of where you're listening in from. I always love to see where all of you are all over the world. So today's episode has been sponsored by Applied Psychology, applying social psychology, cognitive psychology, and more to real-world problems. So the reason why this is a brilliant sponsor for today's episode is because this great, really easy to understand book actually has quite a few sections and chapters on language development and language interventions. Because what a speech and language therapist does is that they use different interventions, different techniques to improve a children's reading abilities. And the applied psychology book really goes into this in a lot more depth. So it looks at how does language work, but also what are the different interventions that a speech and language therapist can use, and what are the effectiveness. So, if you want to learn about how to improve a children's language, what are some of the barriers that children face when it comes to their language, then this is a great, really easy to understand book that's going to help you improve your understanding. So I really do recommend it. And then there's so many other great chapters on sports psychology, business psychology, conspiracy theories, misinformation, and so many more topics that I flat out love. So if you want to learn more, please check out Applied Psychology, Applying Social Psychology, Cognitive Psychology, and more. Available from all major ebook retailers. You can order the paperback and hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore, or local library if you request it. And whilst buying books helps to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons. Your support shows that you like the show and you want it to continue. So if you wanted to become a patron of the show and get tons of great rewards, then now you can at patreon.com/the Psychology World Podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. So that's enough of the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about what does a speech and language therapist do? So this is a great podcast episode. Going to learn a lot. So let's dive into it. Why might a psychology graduate want to become a speech and language therapist? So all of us are probably well aware that the journey to becoming a qualified psychologist is long, bendy, and it is never straightforward. Therefore, you might want to become a speech and language therapist because you like working with children, you've always enjoyed language work, and you want to improve lives. Or, whilst I love the idea of improving lives, and this is definitely one of the reasons why I want to become a clinical psychologist in the future, at first I'll be honest, and I do admit this is risky to admit in a public, but wanting to become a speech and language therapy assistant wasn't my first idea. Instead, I'm using this as an opportunity to work in the UK's NHS, so the National Health Service, work with children with language difficulties, and this will help me build up my clinical experience, something I desperately need if I'm ever going to become a clinical psychologist. In addition, working as a speech and language therapy assistant would be a useful way to use my knowledge of language development, child development, and everything else that I've learned about in developmental psychology over the years. Overall, you might want to work in a speech and language therapy as a way to gain work experience, improve lives, and most importantly, learn clinical skills for your future psychology career. What does a speech and language therapist do? Thankfully, being a speech and language therapist gives you a lot of variation in your work life. That's something that's very important to me because, in theory, I flat out hate doing the same thing in the job over and over again. Yet, because of autism, and I can see this in my own author business, I do like doing small repetitive tasks. But equally, in outreach, I flat out love the variation. Like 2 days are never the same. But then same goes for the author business. I'm digressing. So back to the blog post. However, side note over. As a speech and language therapist, you can help clients with a range of different conditions, and you'll be working in a multidisciplinary team. For example, I've worked with speech and language therapists alongside clinical psychologists, nurses, doctors, and other healthcare professionals, as well as you will get to work with clients in a range of settings, like hospitals, clients' homes, and community clinics. I had the chance to work with speech and language therapists in a residential care setting, clinics, and clients' own homes before. And I've asked my parents this a question, and they said when I had a speech and language therapy as a toddler, I had it at a community clinic. Moreover, as a speech and language therapist, you can help adults with a stutter, hearing impairment, learning difficulties, mental health difficulties, physical disabilities, voice problems, and any eating, swallowing, or communication difficulties after a neurological impairment and slash or neurodegenerative conditions. For example, if a client has experienced a stroke, dementia, head injury, or Parkinson's disease. Lastly, for this section, you can support children with a cleft lip and palate, a stutter, a voice disorder, selective mutism, specific difficulties in pronouncing sounds, developmental language disorders, and any mild, moderate, or severe learning difficulties as a speech and language therapist. What is a speech and language therapy assistant? So, considering that this is the job in to-do that I have coming up for next week, I want to learn a little more about the role. Therefore, a speech and language therapy assistant works in a frontline role, supporting clients with conditions that negatively impact their feeding, swallowing, and communication. Also, a lot of people use this as a first step towards becoming a speech and language therapist. Speech and language assistants work closely with a speech and language therapist and other healthcare professionals in community clinics, special and mainstream schools, hospitals, and the client's own homes, as well as their tasks can include preparing rooms and equipment, updating patient records, writing important reports on the client's condition, and helping clients during their appointments. What is the working life of a speech and language therapist? As a speech and language therapist, you will be providing language support, care, and interventions to children and young people and adults with difficulties in eating, drinking, communication, and swallowing, as well as you might get to work with individuals who have difficulty speaking and communicating because of physical or psychological reasons. This includes autistic people and other individuals with neurodivergent conditions. Moreover, speech and language therapists work with people whose needs varies, from children whose language is just slow to develop, all the way up to older adults who have speaking difficulties because of an injury or illness. How does someone get qualified to become a speech and language therapist? So below is an extract from my book, Applied Psychology. Open quote. Personally, I can attest that these therapists are amazing and do the work of the gods, because I needed them when I was very young, and without them I wouldn't have been able to talk, and not only talk and speak, but go on to become an audiobook narrator and podcaster, so thank you. Therefore, in case you want to become one of these amazing people, this is the typical pathway that you can take in the UK. Firstly, you need to do an undergraduate degree in science, language, or psychology and get at least a 2-1. Then you would study speech and language therapy at master's level, with this lasting at least 2 years. Now, but the reason why I'm mentioning this in a psychology book is because a lot of psychology students go on to do this career, as well as, in addition to the normal student support, the UK government, at least at the time of writing, and this should still be true at the time of the recording, you will get at least £5,000 a year from the UK government, and this isn't means attested or repayable, which is brilliant. And if you want to learn more, you can find out more information from the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy. Close quote. Days of working with a speech and language therapist. And below is an extract from the podcast episode, Lessons Learned from a Week in a Learning Disability Team. Open a quote. There wasn't a great amount of things that happened on the Tuesday, or nothing that was very memorable, but I know I learnt a lot from the speech and language therapy team, which I was always going to be interested in, considering that I had to go through extensive speech and language therapy as a child because I was effectively mute. In addition, it was really good to learn about how the speech and language therapy team didn't only deal with talking and communication issues, but people with learning disabilities. They did feeding and drinking difficulties too. That was something that I've heard mentioned a few times, but I couldn't understand why this was a speech and languages job because it was eating, not communication. A while later, during one of my conversations with one of the clinical leads for the team, they explained to me that speech and language therapy team is perfectly suited for these difficulties because they all rely on the same muscles and mechanisms. If someone is having a eating and swallowing difficulties above the lungs, then it is speech and language therapist's job to support the client. But if a bit of food that falls into the lungs or something similar, then it is a medical job because the food could start rotting inside the lung. That would cause tons of problems if it happens. Furthermore, a non learning disability speech and language team might have 80% of their caseload focusing on communication and 20% eating difficulties. Yet, when it comes to learning difficulties, this is reversed due to people with learning disabilities might have a bad posture, developmental difficulties, and other factors caused by their learning disabilities that prevent them from swallowing and drinking normally. One solution might be for the speech and language team to remind the staff to sit the client upwards more when eating and drinking, especially if their posture makes them lean to one side. Then on the Thursday, I already explained the afternoon visit when me and the speech and language therapist went out to an assisted living farm to assess a woman for her communication needs while she was making sausage rolls. However, in the morning, we went to an assisted living house or apartment complex, might be a better term, to talk to a man that had some communication aids designed for him. And this was really fascinating to see how the assessment worked and the therapist booklet and the one test that I really liked. What happened is that you read the client a very short story, and for a podcasting ease, I will really cut it down. So you might say, Harry was watching a video with his grandson, and Harry jumped at a scary moment. Then, to the client, you would ask a simple question, like, was Harry alone? And this time, the client said yes. So this I found really interesting because I just watched the man point to a ton of objects and say what they were, but he couldn't follow a simple, and I do say in air quotes, story. It was interesting and a useful test. So that's a brief summary of the speech and language team, and I did learn tons from these people. Close a quote. Conclusion. So I always really enjoy these psychology career podcast episodes because as much as we want to be assistant psychologists, or we at least want to get a job that is directly related to psychology, that sadly isn't the reality of the world. And if you're disappointed and sad about that, then please allow yourself to feel and process these emotions. Whatever you're feeling about the difficulty of getting a psychology role, after years of studying at a university, those feelings are valid, normal, and very understandable. I'm feeling them too. Therefore, at the end of this podcast episode, you've learned a lot about what speech and language therapists do, who do they support, how to become a speech and language therapist, among a whole host of other topics. So here are some questions for you to think about at the end of this episode. Do you have any interest in speech and language therapy? If yes, why? If not, why not? Do you have any skills, qualifications, or life experiences that might help you to become a speech and language therapist? How do you think becoming a speech and language therapist might help your psychology journey? What's stopping you from applying for speech and language therapy assistant roles. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. I know that I did, because even as I was rereading that, I was like, oh yes, I've actually forgotten that I did that I've witnessed that I've got that egg experience that I can draw on in my interview on Monday. So it's really useful, really insightful. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode just as much as I did. Speaking of which, if you know anyone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the words about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, please check out Applied Psychology, Applying Social Psychology, Cognitive Psychology, and more to real world problems, available in all the usual places. And if you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis and get to access tons of great rewards, including over 70 exclusive blog posts, then please head on over to patreon.com/the Psychology World podcast. If you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at connorwhiteley.net. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time.